Today I'm going to be showing you how to make your own quilted sewing machine cover. I made my first quilted sewing machine cover over a year ago, which I shared with you all on Instagram, and you guys have been hounding me in the comments to make a tutorial for this. And I know it's a year on, but we are finally here. This is the perfect beginner sewing project, as A, you don't need a sewing pattern, and B, it's just some squares, bias binding and some ties on the side sewn together. It's super simple. So if you're someone who has your sewing machine stuffed away in a cupboard, or it's sitting in the corner of the room gathering dust, this is your sign to get it out and start sewing. Understandably, not everybody's sewing machine is going to have the exact same dimensions as my own. In the following clip, you'll be able to see what my dimensions are and compare it to your own sewing machine. Some of you might have extendable tables where you want your quilted sewing machine cover to be a lot wider than mine. Just be aware that you will need to purchase another fat quarter of both your colours to accommodate for the extra squares. I have had a look online. Generally speaking, domestic sewing machines don't differ too much to my dimensions. They might be 2 to 3 centimetres taller or shorter, but they are very similar in height, width and depth. But you can, of course, compare it to your own, and you can make adjustments as you see fit. So finally, let's get into it. Make sure to tag me in your makes on Instagram, and you know where I am if you have any questions. You can get in touch in the comments below through Instagram, TikTok, and I'll always get back to you. So enjoy. So first off, I just wanted to share the dimensions of my own sewing machine. As I explained earlier, if your sewing machine is significantly wider than mine, you may want to add another column of squares to accommodate the extra width. And this is everything you'll need to make the sewing machine cover, which includes 1 metre or 1 yard of wadding or batting, 1 metre or 1 yard of lining fabric, 1 fat quarter for your first colour, another fat quarter for your second colour, and 4 metres or 4 yards of bias binding. The bias binding can be store-bought or handmade yourself depending on your sewing level and how experienced you are. From 1 fat quarter, cut 20 squares measuring 11 centimetres by 11 centimetres or 4 1/4 inch by 4 1/4 inch. Repeat that with your second fat quarter so then that you have a total of 40 squares. I just want to highlight that I know that fat quarters can differ slightly depending on what country you live in, but the size of my fat quarter is 45 centimetres by 55 centimetres or 18 inches by 22 inches, which means roughly you should have a 6 centimetre or 2.3 inch strip left over after you've cut 20 squares from your fat quarter, which unfortunately leaves little to no room for error. So just make sure that you're double checking your measurements before you're cutting out your squares. As they say in the sewing world, measure twice and cut once. I'm honestly so obsessed with this heart print fabric. I got it from Etsy. I'll pop in the description below what Etsy shop I got it from, but I need to buy some more because it's just so adorable. Now that I've finished cutting out all 20 squares in my first fat quarter, I'm moving on to my second fat quarter and cutting another 20 squares. If you're wondering what type of ruler I'm using, it's called a Pattern Master, and I've literally had this one since I started uni about 5 years ago, and it's such a lifesaver when you want to get those 90-degree angles or even a 45-degree angle when you're cutting on the bias. I highly recommend them. I think you can get them at your local craft store, or you can purchase one from Amazon. Once you finish cutting out all 40 squares, we're going to be making a grid. We're going to be doing it in a checkerboard style, and it's going to be 5 squares across and 8 squares down. When I'm organising my squares at this stage, I just like to make sure that all the grain lines are going in the right direction and checking that if I have a print on any of my squares, that they are facing the right way up. This has to be my favourite part of quilting because you can finally see it starting to come together. Once all your squares have been laid out in the correct pattern, we need to join the squares together. Begin with the first row and place the right sides together and use a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure that as you join the squares that you're alternating the colours as you go. It's really important at this stage to make sure that your seam allowances are super accurate so that your squares all look the exact same size. Continue joining the squares until you have 2 complete rows, and then I'm going to explain how to press the seams. I'm still a beginner when it comes to quilting, but I know how you press the seams is a hot topic in the quilting world. So what we're going to be doing today is called nesting your seams. And in a nutshell, that basically means pressing your seam allowances in opposite directions so that your two fabrics almost interlock as you sew. Typically in the sewing world, you're told to press your seams open, as you can see on the screen now. But what we want to be doing is pressing the seams in opposite directions. Now, ideally, you want to be pressing your seam allowances towards your darker square. So if you have a darker pattern or a darker fabric, press the seam allowances towards that direction. This is so that the seam allowances don't become visible from the right side of your fabric, as lighter shade fabrics can be more transparent and then your seam allowances will be visible, which is exactly what we don't want. So now that I've pressed the seams on my first row, you can see my seam allowances are facing in opposite directions. Now I'm going to be repeating that process for my second row, so pressing my seam allowances towards my dark square so that they sit in opposite directions. Now that all the seam allowances have been pressed in the correct direction on both rows, this will really reduce the bulk where the seams meet. And it's also going to help us achieve pinpoint accuracy when aligning the edge of each square. Place your rows right sides together, lining up the edges of the squares so that the seams align. Use clips to position the fabric into place. As I place the two rows together, you can probably imagine now if we'd pressed all our seam allowances in the same direction, that would be a lot of fabric for your needle to sew over. Whereas this way, with the seam allowances pressed in opposite directions, the seams kind of interlock, and this provides a much neater finish as it's much easier to see where the seam lines are when you're aligning the rows together. After I've clipped my rows into place, I like to just check from the right side of my fabric that everything is aligned correctly before I stitch into place. Once I'm happy with how it looks, I head over to my sewing machine and I'm going to attach right sides together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Making sure as I sew that my seam allowances are still positioned in opposite directions. Once you finish stitching your first two rows together, you can open up the seam with the wrong side of the fabric facing you and press that seam open, making sure to use plenty of steam so that your seam allowances lie nice and flat. Then turn the fabric over so that the right side is facing you and press the seam again. At this point, it might be more clear why I've asked you to nest your layers, as later on we're going to be stitching in the ditch. Now, if we'd pressed our seams open, we wouldn't really be stitching onto anything, as we would just be stitching through the seam, which would also make our stitches and our seams much weaker. But with our seam allowances pressed in opposite directions, when we stitch in the ditch later on, we're actually going to be stitching onto something, making our seams nice and strong. Now you're simply going to grab your third row and repeat the process again. So your seam allowances should be pressed in opposite directions, typically to the darker square or darker pattern, then aligning the seams so that the colours don't overlap and positioning in place with a clip. If you're finding it particularly hard to perfectly align your squares, you can just sew the part where the seams match and where you've placed the clips. Then you can check from the right side of your fabric that all the squares align perfectly, and then you can go back in and sew the rest of the seam. After you sew each row, remember to head over to your ironing board and press the seams open from the wrong side, and then you're turning to the right side to press the seams again. Repeat this process until all 8 rows are stitched together. Once I've finished my grid, I just like to ensure that all the seam allowances are facing the correct direction, everything's been pressed correctly, and that all the seams align perfectly. And as I explained earlier, you should have 5 squares going across and 8 squares down. Place the lining fabric so that the wrong side is facing you, and then place your wadding or your batting on top. You want your wadding and your lining fabric to be slightly larger than your patchwork fabric. Ideally, you want your lining fabric and your wadding or batting to extend at least 5 centimeters or 2 inches around each edge. Then run the iron over your patchwork fabric just to ensure all the seams are lying flat. Now it's time to attach all 3 layers. That's the lining, wadding and the patchwork, by stitching in the ditch to hold everything in place. To keep all 3 layers positioned, you can use as many or as little pins as you'd like. This is just so that the fabric doesn't move around a lot as we are stitching in the ditch. When we actually get round to stitching in the ditch, you may want to swap your standard sewing machine foot for a walking foot. A walking foot just prevents fabric layers such as your batting and your lining fabric from shifting, buckling or creating puckers. It's great if you have one, but it's not absolutely essential. For example, I haven't used one for making my sewing machine cover. When stitching all 3 layers of your cover together, you want to start from the centre and work your way outwards. This just ensures that the quilt stays flat and smooth and prevents the fabric from distorting, wrinkling or bunching up as you work. So stitching in the ditch is essentially sewing down the channel of an existing seam, also known as the ditch, to secure the fabric into place. You'll want to be using a stitch length that's something between 2.5mm and 3mm. It's also really important to take your time when you're stitching in the ditch, as it's very easy for you to wobble those seam lines, and we don't want this stitch to be obvious from the right side. We really want it to be concealed in the seam channel. Once I finish stitching in the ditch along all the horizontal seams, I can now move on to the vertical seams. So I find the seam line that's closest to the centre and work my way outwards, repeating stitching in the ditch along all the seam lines. Once you finish stitching in the ditch along all your columns and rows, you can cut away the excess wadding or batting and lining fabric, making it the same size as your patchwork fabric. Now we need to attach bias binding to the outer edge of our sewing machine cover so we can conceal all those raw edges. I've constructed my own bias binding using my lining fabric, but if you've used store-bought bias binding, it should look a little something like this. Now we're going to start attaching the bias binding on the 5th row of our sewing machine cover. You're going to attach the right side of the bias binding to the right side of the sewing machine cover. Open up the bias binding and align the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the sewing machine cover. Because we're working with quite a lot of layers of fabric at this point, I like to use clips to position the fabric into place. Use a water or heat soluble pen to mark 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch from the corner of the sewing machine cover. This marking indicates where you should stop stitching. Use that crease line as an indication of where your stitch line should go. Make sure to leave 3 centimeters or 1 inch of the bias binding unsewn, as this is where we're going to join the 2 ends later on. And as I mentioned earlier, use the first crease line closest to the raw edge as your stitching guide. Remember to end your stitch at the mark we made earlier and backstitch to secure. Then lift your presser foot and take the fabric out of the machine. Fold the bias binding straight up away from the edge so that it forms a diagonal fold at the corner. Then fold it back down so the raw edge lines up with the next side of the fabric. This creates a nice, neat, mitered corner. Use a water or heat soluble pen, or if you don't have one of those, just use a sewing pin to mark where your stitch line last ended. This mark indicates where your new stitch line is going to begin. So now you can head back over to your sewing machine and continue sewing on that outer crease line, aligning both the raw edge of the bias binding to the raw edge of the sewing machine cover. As I reach my second corner, I'm going to repeat the whole process again and again for the 3rd and 4th corner. Once you've worked your way around the entire sewing machine cover, you're then going to reach the other end of your bias binding. Stitch the bias binding as close as you can to the starting point, then remove your fabric from the presser foot, cut away the excess bias binding but leaving at least 1 centimeter seam allowance, as then you can join the 2 ends of the bias binding together. Once you stitch the two ends of the bias binding together, you can cut any excess fabric away and make sure to press the seam well. Now head over to your ironing board and give all those bias binding seams a really good press. Turn the sewing machine cover so the lining side is facing you and making sure that the bias binding is well out of the way. Then we want to trim down the seam allowances of all 3 layers plus the bias binding. This is just going to help reduce any bulk when we are top stitching the bias binding down. Now you can fold the bias binding to the wrong side of your sewing machine cover and clip in place. Fold the excess bias binding at the corner of your sewing machine cover to make a nice clean mitered corner. On the wrong side of your fabric, top stitch the bias binding down using a 0.3cm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the inner folded edge. If your stitch line is positioned correctly, on the right side of your bias binding, the stitch line will be positioned 0.3cm or 1/8 of an inch from the inner folded edge as well. Once you finish top stitching your bias binding around the entire edge of your sewing machine cover, this is what it should be looking like. Now we're so close to finishing, all we have to do is make 4 straps or 4 ties to tie the sides of the sewing machine cover. And to do that, you'll need to use your remaining bias binding to cut 4 ties that are 45cm long or 17.5 inches long. Fold each end of the tie inwards by 1cm or 3/8 of an inch and press into position. Then fold each raw edge of the bias binding to the centre of the bias binding by 1cm or 3/8 of an inch, and then fold it in on itself again. Top stitch the folds into position using a 0.3cm or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you finish constructing the first tie, repeat this process for the remaining 3 ties. Once you finish constructing all 4 ties, all you need to do is attach the ties to the wrong side of the sewing machine cover. Position each tie 19cm or 7.5 inches from the bottom edge of the cover. When you're stitching each tie into place, try to sew over the same stitch you used to top stitch your bias binding down. Once you've stitched all the ties into place, all that's left to do is snip off any loose threads and give the cover a final press. Then head on over to your machine and take your top thread off and tuck your spool holder away, and you can place your new sewing machine cover over your sewing machine and use the ties to make a bow either side. I really hope you've enjoyed this sewing tutorial, and make sure to tag me in your makes if you've made your own sewing machine cover, as I would love to see them. And make sure to hit subscribe for more sewing projects, patterns and easy to follow tutorials.